What do you believe are sort of the key components of an effective rehab in high performance sport?
For me, everything comes back to having a process and a system around what happens, I guess, when an injury occurs. So you need to have everyone in your high performance team and your medical team and your coaching team on the same page. So for me, I like to break it down into when the injury happens, what happens from there. So that's when we as S&C coaches are really relying on the doctors and the physios to give us that diagnosis. Once we've dialed down into a diagnosis, I think then it's really important that you come up with a plan. So depending on what that injury is and the timeframes, you might plan if it's a 21-day hamstring for the whole length of period up to a return to play. If it's a 6-month bone stress injury, you might just plan for the next month. But then when you've got that plan together, you have to communicate it to your key stakeholders. So in terms of who they are, the athlete is really important that they're involved in the plan.
And what about the process of loading and how to load, specific injured tissues?
Well, this is actually one of the areas I feel that being a rehab S&C and working intensely in this space is really valuable as you learn as an S&C coach. So learning when is it appropriate to load an injured tissue. So for instance, if we're talking about a hamstring, how early are you going to introduce isometric load? How early are you going to return to run? When can you go from your isometrics and build onto your next stage of that rehab? And everyone has different hamstring templates, so I won't go through exactly what ours is, but I think working in S&C exposes you to a whole heap of different injuries. So it might be bone stress, it might be joint, it might be muscle, it might be musculotendinous junction. And building your experience of working with each of those categories of injury and then learning how to actually, I guess, stimulate that tissue in a rehab setting.
What about gaining an in-depth knowledge about functional anatomy? How important is that in the context of high performance sport and rehabilitation?
Yeah, well, it's very similar to what I was just saying, I guess. But for me, that's been a huge area of development over the last probably 8 years that I've been at Fremantle. And a lot of it has been from being exposed to different injuries and then learning about how you can load them safely when you're ready to load them. I think, again, that's not an area that when I went to university anyway, it was super in depth. Like you do a basic level of, what the muscles of the hamstring are, and the quadricep muscles. But in terms of how, I guess, to rehab something intently, but also further to that, if we're working with, say, an navicular, for instance, what inserts onto the, and then from that instance, what do we need to avoid in early stage rehab? So that's one that you might learn through experience. Again, that practical example is something that I think is best learned through experience, or that's how I found it anyway.
How has the 3 years that you were in that rehab role helped shape your philosophy in the current role where you're managing the main group and looking after the senior players from the healthy ones from a strength and power point of view?
It's definitely helped. My 3 years working really closely in rehab has definitely set me up to have a better understanding of how athletes can pull up from that. During that 3 years, I worked with a huge amount of our athletes, whether it was for 2 weeks or whether it was for 6 months, who are still at the club. So in terms of the relationships you build when you're there and it's you one-on-one in the gym and everyone else is gone or whatever it is, those relationships are still paying dividends. And I think that's where I found it really beneficial. Like the strength and conditioning side of things and the strength and power, you can really pivot to a performance model when you're running the whole program, and it's about performance. And you're going to have some different levels on top of that in terms of what you're doing from injury risk mitigation in terms of doing Nordics and what are you doing around your calves and that sort of thing.
So I guess in the last sort of six years, how far have you seen from a technology point of view, methodologies, how far have they sort of advanced in the industry of AFL reconditioning?
Yeah, I guess we're just much more objective now. So I guess we've always had dynamometers in my time. So we've always, I guess, felt like we've had enough measures. But now we can be very objective with all of our athletes and generally have baselines as well, which is one of the luxuries of elite sport. I know in community sport or sub-elite levels, you're not going to have this. But products like dual force plates that we use, like the force frames, so we've got dynamometry around hips. For given guys, we've got hamstring or quad dyno. We've got base level jump data for both, I guess, counter movement jumps, but also repeat contacts and more a fast v slow counter movement. And we've almost got an objective profile from a testing perspective, but then we've also got what do they do from a compound lifting perspective. So we're lucky enough to have GymAware. So there's a lot of different technologies that all add a layer of context to the scenario to give us, I guess, a baseline of each player when they're up and going. And then depending what the injury is, we use that quite extensively in terms of getting them back to play.